Elizabeth Fry was born in the early 1800s. You can see her right there on the screen. She came from a wealthy home, a woman of means. And the interesting thing is this dear woman, Elizabeth, could have lived out her life in affluence and convenience, but she chose a different road. What's interesting, when you look at her life story, she gave birth to 11 children, a task unto itself, I might say. But when you look into her story, you don't hear much about raising 11 children. What you do hear about is that she was offended, deeply offended, by the English prison system for women. So in the early 1800s, pre-Dickinson, pre-Charles Dickens, she looked at the prison system for women and she was appalled. She was also appalled at the plight of the homeless, as she saw on the London streets. And she was deeply offended at the lack of decent medical care that took place in hospitals. And this woman decided that something had to be done. She couldn't just sit and watch it. Something needed to be done. She started in England the first national prison reform organization in England. Listen to the title of it. This is quite interesting. The British Ladies' Society for Promoting the Reformation of Female Prisoners. Come and join. She was deeply pained by the homeless on the streets, and for the first time in history, no one had done this. She started a nightly shelter to care for the homeless in London so they could find a place to be at night, to be warm. Sound familiar? We do this in January, February here at St. Luke for a week. This is where it started. She was so bothered by the lack of decent medical care at the age of 60, she started the first nursing school in England. Later, you know of, in history, the first real nurse is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale replicated her nursing school. The interesting thing is you and I haven't really heard of her. But she was a remarkable woman, and she left an extraordinary legacy by the time she died at the age of 65. She was an outstanding woman. What I have found so striking is everything she did really was just being who she is. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about core values. And what is a core value? Core value are those things which we hold dear and become the motivators of who we are. Each of us here in this room, we all have core values that are prompters and motivators inside of us. They're the values that we simply live out. And oftentimes those values are difficult to articulate. If you ask people what their core values are, they will often stumble around with words trying to figure out what would be the right words to share. We simply don't talk core values. We really don't. We don't talk what are core values. You know what we do with our core values is we live our core values. We live them. So each of you has a core value inside of you, a variety of them, and you live out those core values just by who you are day to day. You lived one out this morning by even getting here. Because no matter what the obstacles were at getting here, you got here. You see, that's a core value. Your decisions, and we try to do this, and we're moving into graduation season now, as you know, college and high school. We always look at the decisions that people make to say, we always ask a graduate, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do? Where are you going to go to school? What are you going to do with your degree? Your decisions become an expression of your core values. Elizabeth Fry did what she did with a deep passion for her faith. You see, Elizabeth Fry, this dear woman from the 1800s, was a devout Quaker. She was an active Quaker. And she did what she was called to do. Her faith was a prompter in her life. And she started this as a young woman till the day she died. I don't think she had a committee meeting to figure out her core values or to figure out what she should actually do. She just did. Elizabeth was being Elizabeth. That's what she was doing with her core values. A few years ago, my oldest daughter Emily went to South Africa, and they did a little safari ride into the bush. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures. They were driving next to a river, and they were on one side of the river, and then there was, on the other side of the river, a herd of elephants. Those are elephants. Cute kind of guy critters, aren't they? They're walking along. They're just doing what elephants do, living life. When they met a truck. Let's see the next picture. And there you see this, we're going to say, we'll call it a Toyota truck. Bennett's for you. He's an engineer at Toyota, so we'll call it a Toyota truck today. And there this guy's driving along, and he sees the elephants, and the elephants see him. Now, notice in the preceding picture, can you go back one, Patty? Yeah, they're just hanging out. You see how they're all just kind of lining there, walking, hanging out, just being elephants. And then they saw the truck. Go to the next picture. There you go, and there's the picture. And notice how they've kind of lined up. This is an issue. Because look at picture number 3. Picture number 3 is the truck and the elephants, and you see how the big guy right there in the forefront, the larger one, but they're all lined up parallel looking at the truck. Now, I have a question for you. Who loses? Who loses? Well, we kind of know that, don't we? The truck loses. But you know what's really going on? There's a core value of elephants being lived out right here in this picture. You go, elephants have core values? They do. They do have a core value. Because look what's behind the big row of elephants facing the truck. What do you see there? You see a little baby elephant. The little cuddly guy that you want to go and hug, and because every elephant needs to be loved. You want to hug that little elephant. You see, the core value of the elephant is protect the baby at all costs. Surround the baby. Protect the child. The big elephant saw the truck. The truck was a threat. A threat not to the elephants. They'll be fine. They're thinking about the baby. So you'll notice the baby is put behind them. There's an elephant behind the baby, and then there's a line of elephants in the front. That truck ain't getting to that baby. It ain't getting there. What do you think the truck driver did? He backed up and turned around. That's what the truck driver did. You ain't winning against elephants. Because you see, the elephants are there to protect the baby. It's the core value of who they are. The elephants didn't surround and have a committee meeting. We got a truck. What are we going to do with this truck today? Because we got to take care of little baby Edgar. What are we going to do with little Edgar? We got to protect the babe. So, and then let's vote. Who's going in front this time? I did it last time. Who's going this time? Do you ever feel like core values get convoluted into all sorts of other conversations? And you wonder, how do we live them? And that's what I think that happens. We get distracted from what our real values are. They just immediately reacted because this is what they do. Elephants were being elephants. No different than Elizabeth Fry was being Elizabeth Fry when she said that prisons for women, the way they were being treated was wrong. And the homeless dying on the streets in London is wrong. And the medical care in hospitals was neglected and people were dying was wrong. And Elizabeth was simply being Elizabeth. These things need to be attacked and changed. Her faith called her to that. And the elephants are being the elephants. Protect the baby. Protect the child. There was no question. You protect the babe. Yes. That's over there in that Fink section. And now we come to the story of Ruth and Naomi. It's a wonderfully remarkable story. Naomi is the mother-in-law, and she was married to a man named Elimelech. And they had 2 boys. One's name was Mahlon, and the other was Kilian. And they came from a small town called Bethlehem. Have you heard of Bethlehem? Raise your hands. Oh, good. Glad you're with me. They were in Bethlehem. The irony is the word Bethlehem means, Beth in Hebrew means house. Lahem means bread. So Bethlehem was known as the house of bread. So there were lots of fields where grain and barley were growing, and so there was a prosperous area where you would have food. But a famine came. So the irony is, here was the city called the house of bread, but there was no food. People were starving to death in the house of bread. In fact, it got so bad that Elimelech and Naomi had to have a conversation, because what are we going to do? We got to take care of our family. And they decided to become refugees. Good people who became refugees. And they decided to go to the country of Moab. You know where Moab is today if you look at a map. Moab is in the country of Jordan. And so they crossed the river from Israel, the Jordan River. They crossed the river and they went to Moab, which was right on the border of the Dead Sea. And they went there to establish life and maybe get away from the famine and grow crops, which, by the way, seemed to work okay. The catch that you may not know is that Moab was an enemy of Israel. There was a historical animosity between these two countries. The Israelites hated the Moabites, and the Moabites hated the Israelites. But here was a family desperate enough that they decided to go into this other country because they needed food to eat. So Elimelech and Naomi take their two boys and they move and they establish life there. We know they're at least 10 years. We know that. And we know in verse 3 that a terrible thing happened. Elimelech died. So Naomi now becomes a widow, and not something she planned or intended, but she now is without her husband. But of course she has her two boys, and they got married to Orpah, and they got married to Ruth, and they had good marriages. You can see that. The lesson I just read a few minutes ago, they had a great relationship with their mother-in-law. This was not a bad story about daughters-in-laws and mothers-in-laws. This is a really good story. Sometimes I think the mother-in-law thing takes a pretty bad rap here, because you can have some wonderful, wonderful relationships. And this is a good example of these women who figured out how to make life work together. And these women had got married to the boys, and they had a good relationship. Then Elimelech dies, but they're going to take care of Naomi. You could see that. You could see these sons are going to take care of their mom, and then the boys die. We don't know what happened. We don't know the story. But now the sons die. Now we have 3 widows. And Naomi, in a fit of desperation and not knowing what to do, she has only one option: go home to the distant relatives in Bethlehem, and maybe she can beg a life somewhere in Bethlehem with some foreign distant relative who they haven't seen in more than a decade. And so she tells the other young women, I'm releasing you. Go home to your families. Start life over. I can't take care of you. It is impossible for me to care for you. I can't do it. And I love you. You know I love you. And you see in the text that succinctly says that there was some intense conversation that took place. Both of these daughter-in-laws, they loved Naomi, and Naomi loved them. And you can see that when you read the text, you can see the energy and the remorse and the hurt and the passion. No, we can't leave you. And finally she says, leave. You have to go. I can't do anything to take care of you. I can do nothing. I don't want to take responsibility for you, because you could starve to death in Bethlehem. That's an irony. Starve in the house of bread. And Orpah decides to go home to her family in tears. She says, all right, I'll leave. But Ruth refuses. She refuses. You see, they lived in a period of time in the book of Judges. If you read the Old Testament, they said this in the book of Judges, that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It was a place of selfishness and anarchy and chaos. It was not a good period of time. It was an awful period of time. And Ruth and Naomi lived in this period of time. And that's why when I look at Scripture and you read why books are there and what God's doing under inspiration, here's the voice of Ruth in the midst of all the terrible stuff of the book of Judges. So any of you have known the book of Judges, it's not a happy book. But Ruth is. And Ruth lived in this period of time. Naomi lived in this period of time. They lived in a period of time that was filled with anarchy, chaos, and fear. Faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was only a whisper in all Israel. It was simply a whisper. Yet coming out of Moab, we have the story of Ruth, a daughter-in-law, Naomi, a mother-in-law, and they came forward. And what we see in this period of time, we see that there's a God that lives in the whispers. Do you ever feel like God just isn't very loud? And you're asking God for direction, and you're asking God for a hope, and you're asking God what next. And you see what Ruth and Naomi were learning and discovering is that God lives in the whispers. He lives in the quiet. God dwells in the quiet places where we can often wonder where God is. And I'm going to tell you, in the whispers, Naomi certainly wondered. Think about it. She lost her husband. She lost her sons. She's going home to Bethlehem with her head bowed in humiliation. And she's going to have to beg for someone to care. And then in the midst of this, God brings into Naomi's life Ruth. And Ruth reaches in to Naomi's life and says, life isn't lost. Life has hope. We may feel desperate, but God is the God in the whispers. And this is that words from Ruth that are so astounding in loyalty. And by the way, let's get this straight. People use this in weddings. This is not a wedding text. Just so we have this all in context, this is between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, not between a husband and a wife. That's a different text. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Don't force me to leave you. Then she says, amazing language. The loyalty here. Think about core values. The loyalty that Ruth demonstrates. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. I will become an Israelite. This enemy of Moab, I will become an Israelite. And your God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, will be my God. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. What an extraordinary voice of loyalty. Wouldn't you like a friend like that? Who would not want a relationship like that? Extraordinary language. Right there we see Ruth's core values lived out. Ruth is simply being Ruth. No different than Elizabeth was being Elizabeth. And elephants were being elephants. Ruth was being Ruth. And when you read this short book, you find out there's a story of loyalty between these two women. And it's extraordinary. It's remarkable, that loyalty. Ruth loved her mother-in-law, cared for her. Ruth becomes a follower of the God of Israel. She becomes a woman of faith. And she embraces the God who lives in the whispers and says, your God is my God. And she becomes a faithful woman of God who ultimately marries a faithful man. His name was Boaz. This non-Jewish woman who came from the enemy of Israel has a faith in the God of whispers. And you know what that faith does? Her faithfulness goes on for generations. She leaves a legacy that goes on and on and on and on. Ruth knew God is faithful. And at the birth of her son, Obed, the midwives say to Naomi, isn't this interesting? Say it to Naomi. Ruth gives birth, but they talk to Naomi. And this is what they say to Naomi as she holds the newborn. For your daughter-in-law, they don't even talk about Obed. He's just a side story. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth. That's about it. In that world, in that generation, that was about as high of a commendation as you could give anyone. Your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth. Ruth was simply being Ruth. On March 25th, I did the funeral for Winslow Fox. Some of you will know Winslow and his wife Elizabeth, both gone now, both with Jesus. Winslow and his wife Elizabeth had been members of St. Luke for many years, and in the last few years had been attending ULC. Both he and his wife, as I watched them over the years, were a testimony of lifelong faith. It was in preparation for the funeral, talking with the family, that I found out that Winslow had always wanted to be a medical missionary. You see, Winslow was a family physician. And the obituary said this. It said his model was Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer was the great missionary all the way to the 1950s, received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in Africa. And this is what his obituary said, quote, "Inspired by Albert Schweitzer's reverence for life and desire to alleviate suffering, Winslow decided to become a doctor. And maybe his goal was to go to China and work with the Chinese. That's a core value, isn't it? To alleviate suffering. A few years ago, he met Elizabeth, and they got married, and they're a young couple, and they have desires to do ministry, to be medical missionaries. And they did some short-term medical things, never quite the long-term that they intended. Gail and I were doing a marriage retreat, and I asked Winslow to write a little statement, he and Elizabeth, on their seasons of our life together. And they sat down and they talked to each other, and they wrote up a statement for us, kind of a chronology of their life. And they confirmed, the obituary said one thing, but I had a testimony of years earlier that confirmed it. They wrote, in the early 1940s, each of us wanted to go to China as medical missionaries. Core values don't start when you're old. Joel Pingle, early service high school kid, trying to stay awake in my message. I'm calling you out. Joel and anyone else in here, little babies over there, Hind family looking angelic. Core values don't start when you're old. They really don't. Your core values are already there. They're in you now. They're there now. They start, Alex, when you're young. They do. And then you live them out for the rest of your life. They don't just suddenly pop up. You think, Elizabeth and Winslow, they decided that when they were old. No, Winslow made that decision when he was young. And his wife, when he met her and they got married and all that kind of stuff, she embraced it. She had her core values. She embraced it as well. What stopped them from going to China, he writes, in the early 1940s, each of us wanted to go to China as medical missionaries, and then this thing happened, and you who know history know what happened. The communists took over China, and that stopped that. He said, the communist takeover, that stopped us going to China. As a young couple, they were living out the core value of faithfulness. Ultimately, Elizabeth and Winslow ended up here in Ann Arbor and had a medical practice for many, many years. Mark Batterson, wrote in his book, Chasing the Lions, which I would really recommend you to read. Chasing the Lion, writes this. We live in a culture that celebrates 15 minutes of fame, but God honors a lifetime of faithfulness. That's a core value, a lifetime of faithfulness. You see, Elizabeth Fry was being Elizabeth Fry, and elephants were being elephants, and Ruth was being Ruth, and Winslow and Elizabeth were simply being Winslow and Elizabeth. It's what I wish of you as well. Faithfulness always happens quietly in the whispers of life. It just happens in your quietness. One thing that I'm trying to do, and we're trying to do here at St. Luke, is to encourage you on your own walk of faithfulness, your own journey of being who you are. So Joel being Joel, Alex being Alex, Don Kath being Don Kath. We want you to do this. Out on the table out there, you'll see these cards. It's called Family Dinner. Our staff put these together. So the card has been put together by Susie. I would like you to grab one of these per family. Grab the card, and I'll show you what else is in here. And I want you to write a note to a woman who's been impactful in your life. a woman that's been influential in your life. Yes, it's Mother's Day. Write to a woman that's been impactful in your life. This week I wrote 2 letters, and they're not members of my family. They're people that had a profound influence on my life, because it takes a village, right? It takes people who help you. So I wrote Janice and I wrote Jackie. My family know who they are. These 2 women have been wonderful influences, and their husbands have been a wonderful influence in my life. And I wrote a letter to both of them. I wrote a card. I want you to do that. Grab one off the table. Please, don't just walk by it, because you're hurried to get to breakfast. You will not die. Grab a packet. And in the packet, no matter your season of family, we have put together a menu. And I have a friend who's a food scientist. And she has, my friend Tien, she has put together menus that we're going to have from now through Father's Day. There'll be one a week on the website. You can go now. You'll see a button that says Family Dinner. So you can go on that Family Dinner thing, and you will see a meal that takes about 20 minutes to make. And you can do it with your family. And then you can eat this simple meal. And then you'll see a discussion question, 1 or 2 questions that you can talk about at your family. You see what I'm trying to do, what we're trying to do here, is to help you explore your faith and your families, your homes. So that core value of you being who you are, just as Elizabeth Fry was being Elizabeth Fry and Ruth was being Ruth, that you would have a chance to talk with each other. On Mother's Day and on Father's Day, we're going to come out with a full meal. So so here's a marinara sauce made from scratch, and a fat-free, I like that phrase, raspberry salad dressing that you can make. We've made this. It's a lot of fun. And this is the one that defeats all fat-free. Dessert, I want it, and I've made it. Ultimate chocolate sauce. How do you make it from scratch? And my friend Tien has put these recipes together for you. I want you to grab this when you walk out. You'll see 3 different cards. You can choose. I grabbed the tulip one today, but there's 2 other cards that I want you to grab and to hold on to. I want you to do family together, no matter your season. Like some of us are empty nesters and some of us have little ones. Makes no difference. Some of us are alone. Make the meal. Bring a friend in. Share the food. Be who you are. Be who you are. And what happens with the rest of the story? So Ruth has a son. His name is Obed. Obed has a son, and his name is Jesse. Now, somewhere in this period of time, Ruth and Boaz, they died. They're in the presence of God. But the faith of Ruth and Boaz goes to Obed, and it goes to the son Jesse. And Jesse has a boy. And Garrett, what's his name? It's David. Oh, do we know about David? He becomes a king. And it says in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God speaks to David and says, your throne will last forever. It will never go away. It's called the Davidic covenant. Your throne will never end. Well, it doesn't end, because who's David's descendant? Jesus. The Ruth legacy, the faith of Ruth and Naomi goes to Obed, goes to Jesse, goes to David, goes to Mary, goes to Joseph, and a Redeemer. That's the story. It's a remarkable story because it turns the world upside down. And you and I are that legacy of Ruth today. So grab a card, make some dinner this week. That chocolate sauce is particularly good. And then you can ease guilt by eating the fat-free raspberry dressing. And celebrate who you are. Elephants are elephants. Elizabeth Fry was being Elizabeth Fry. Ruth was being Ruth. And Winslow and Elizabeth were simply being Winslow and Elizabeth. in Christ's name. Amen? Amen. Grab a card, make some food. We all like to eat.